Have you ever seen me use these symbols in my thumbnails or in my editing? Well, these symbols are called hieroglyphics. They are the language that ancient Egyptians used, and that will be our topic for today's video. Hello everyone, this is Advaith, your host for the history of humankind. On today's episode, we'll be discussing hieroglyphics. Now, a disclaimer before we start, I will not be talking about the translation of hieroglyphics into English or Greek. I will only be focusing on the history of their discovery, because you see, this series is called the history of humankind, and so I'll be focusing on the history of their discovery. Now that we have that out of the way, let's start the video. But first, let us introduce ourselves to the characters in our story. First, we have the infamous Napoleon. Second, we have a linguist by the name of Thomas Young. And finally, we have a French linguist by the name Champollion. Actually, a fierce linguistic battle between Thomas Young and Champollion is what led to the discovery of hieroglyphics. Let's see how. Our story begins somewhere in 1798 when Napoleon, the French military commander, led an expedition in Egypt. Here, he worked out the math behind pyramids, wrote elaborate essays on other architectural structures, but most importantly, pioneered the discovery of hieroglyphics. These expeditions led to the discovery of a stone which had an inscription written on it in a place called Rosetta, and hence the stone is now referred to as the Rosetta Stone. This is the Rosetta Stone. It has inscription in 3 different languages. The one on top is ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic. Next is a dialect of Greek called Coptic. Finally, it is ancient Greek. But wait, why was this inscription on the stone written? And why are there 3 different languages? Well, to answer your first question, the inscription was written here as a communication for the coronation or the crowning ceremony of a king. To answer the second, there are 3 languages here because during this period in Egypt, 3 different languages were spoken. That is Egyptian, Coptic and Greek. Now, talking about the decipherment of hieroglyphics. Well, during this period, many scholars could read and write Coptic and ancient Greek. So, the derivation and the decipherment shouldn't be too difficult, right? Wrong. It was an extremely difficult task for the following reasons. You see, the first problem was there were no active speakers or scholars in the language of Egyptian hieroglyphics. The second issue was regarding the nature of the language itself. What did each character represent? Did it represent a word or did it represent separate letters? Now, obviously, the first problem is practically impossible to solve. But when we talk about the second problem, the solution was again hidden in one of Napoleon's excavations. Napoleon discovered through his studies that an ellipse was put around important names in Egyptian hieroglyphics, something like this. This ellipse was called a cartouche. And this gave the first breakthrough in the decipherment. Thomas Young, a scholar who I mentioned earlier, started doing his research. So now all he had to do was look for important names in the Greek writing and find their corresponding cartouche in the hieroglyphic writing. And that's exactly what Thomas Young did. First, he looked for a cartouche in the Egyptian script and he found this cartouche. When enlarged, it looks something like this. Next, he inspected the Greek writing on the Rosetta Stone and the first important name that he found was Ptolemy. Now all he had to do was match the characters to their corresponding phonetic sounds in Greek. And so, Thomas Young came up with this decipherment. After reading this, it reads Ptolemaios or Ptolemaios. So, who was Ptolemaios? Well, the word is actually the Egyptian version of the Greek name Ptolemy. Who was Ptolemy? Well, Ptolemy was a Greek king who was ruling Greece when Greece was in control of Egypt, and hence the Cartouche reads Ptolemaios. But Young wasn't completely correct. He was correct that the writing spelled Ptolemaios, but just wasn't right in attributing the right values to each character, and hence he could not carry on further with his research and study. So now, with Young's failure, all of the work fell to Champollion. What he did was he did not use the Rosetta Stone. Instead, he used another cartouche that he found in one of Napoleon's discoveries. And this cartouche was understood to belong to Cleopatra. He deciphered it something like this: Kleopatra, as shown in the figure. And the last symbol, which is circled here, apparently was supposed to represent that the word was in its feminine form, or the person who the word is referring to was a female. But Champollion wanted to be sure, extremely sure of his work. So he rectified it by applying the decipherment on the Ptolemy cartouche. But this time, it worked. And it spelled something like this. And instead of saying Ptolemaios, it instead said Ptolemies, which is closer to the word Ptolemy and hence is the widely accepted decipherment. After a few more studies, Champollion finally drew a table of all the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics along with their Greek and Coptic counterparts. He documented all of this in a neatly written letter called the Letter to Dacier, a letter Champollion wrote to the French Academy of Inscriptions. So now, why did I tell you all of this? What does this add to our series? It isn't about a king, his reign, or about pyramids or even ancient artifacts. And that is my point. You see, the problem with Egyptology in many people's perception is that it is all about kings, their reigns, pyramids and artifacts. But concepts like hieroglyphics tell us that Egypt is such a vast concept that it is more than just pyramids. Hieroglyphics helped Egyptologists understand the reason behind many things in Egypt, behind many artifacts and pyramids. And hence, it made people realize that history can also come with inference and emotion. In essence, it is important to learn hieroglyphics because they changed the profession of an Egyptologist from that of a treasure hunter to that of a historian.